The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the dusty meeting hall in Kelton, Utah. And Grace Tanner felt her heart drop straight through the floorboards as the man's voice boomed across the crowd of spectators who had gathered on that sweltering August afternoon in 1879. She stood frozen near the back wall, her calico dress damp with perspiration, watching as everything her father had worked for his entire life was about to be sold off to strangers who cared nothing for the memories embedded in every piece of furniture, every tool, every scrap of land that had sustained their family through years of drought and hardship. Sold to the gentleman in the brown vest for $45, the auctioneer declared, pointing his gavel toward a portly man who looked pleased with himself for acquiring her mother's wedding china at such a bargain. Grace swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. The china had survived the journey west in a covered wagon, had graced their table every Sunday for as long as she could remember. And now it belonged to someone else. Her father had died 3 months earlier from pneumonia, leaving behind debts Grace had not known existed. The bank had been patient at first, but patience wore thin when money was involved. And now here she stood at 22 years old, watching her entire world get dismantled piece by piece. She had tried everything to raise the funds needed to satisfy the creditors. She had taken in sewing, sold vegetables from their garden, even worked at the general store for a pittance, but it was never enough. The sum demanded was beyond anything she could hope to earn in a year, let alone the 2 months she had been given. The auctioneer moved on to the next lot, her father's plow and harness equipment. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of all these people who had come to pick over the remains of her family's misfortune like vultures circling a carcass. She recognized most of the faces in the crowd, neighbors who had shared meals with them, who had borrowed tools and returned favors. But not one of them had been able to help when she went knocking on doors asking for a loan. The bidding started, and Grace watched the numbers climb, each one another nail in the coffin of her hopes. When the gavel fell again, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The land itself would be next. The 40 acres her father had homesteaded, where her mother was buried beneath a cottonwood tree near the creek. The thought of strangers owning that ground, perhaps plowing over the grave or cutting down the tree, was almost more than she could bear. Next, we have the land parcel itself, the auctioneer announced, unrolling a map for the crowd to see. 40 acres with water rights, good soil, existing homestead structure. We will start the bidding at $500. Grace felt her legs go weak. $500 might as well have been $5,000. She had exactly $12.37 to her name, the sum total of her last month's worth of work. It was not even enough to bid on a single item, let alone save her home. $500, someone called out. Grace did not turn to see who it was. She could not bear to look at the face of the person who would take her land. $550, another voice countered. $600. The price climbed steadily, and Grace felt herself becoming detached from the scene, as though she were floating somewhere above her body, watching this tragedy unfold from a distance. She should leave, she thought. There was no reason to torture herself by staying, but her feet would not move. Some stubborn part of her insisted on bearing witness to the end. "We have $700, the auctioneer said, scanning the crowd. "Do I hear $750? The room fell silent. Grace finally dared to look and saw that the last bidder was Morton Briggs, a land speculator who had been buying up properties all over the territory. He had a reputation for being ruthless in business, and worse, in his personal dealings. Grace had heard stories about women who worked for him, stories that made her skin crawl. The thought of owing anything to a man like that was revolting. $700 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. $1,000. The voice came from the doorway, deep and rough as gravel, and every head in the room swiveled to locate its source. Grace turned and felt her breath catch in her throat. The man who had spoken stood framed in the doorway, the late afternoon sun creating a halo effect around his massive silhouette. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. Dark hair fell past his collar in waves that looked like they had been trimmed with a knife rather than scissors. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard growth. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt that strained across a chest built from years of hard physical labor. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and self-reliance, the kind of man who belonged to the mountains and wilderness rather than towns and settlements. $1,000, the man repeated, stepping into the room. His boots echoed on the wooden floor as he moved through the crowd, which parted before him like water around a stone. Grace noticed several women staring at him with undisguised interest, and a few men eyeing him with suspicion or wariness. The auctioneer recovered from his surprise quickly. "We have $1,000 from the gentleman. Mr. Briggs, do you wish to counter?" Morton Briggs had turned an unattractive shade of red. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, though he made no move to approach the stranger. The mountain man's eyes, Grace saw, were a striking shade of gray-green, like moss on river stones. They fixed on Briggs with an intensity that made the other man take an involuntary step backward. "Name's Elijah Edwards," he said quietly, "and I am making a bid on this property." $1,100, Briggs said, his voice tight with anger. $1,500, Elijah countered without hesitation. A collective gasp went through the room. That was more than double the opening bid, well above the property's assessed value. Grace felt dizzy. Why would a stranger pay so much for land he had presumably never even seen? Briggs opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. $1,600, he finally managed. $2,000. Elijah's voice remained calm, almost bored, as though he were discussing the weather rather than a sum of money that most people in Kelton would not see in 5 years of work. The auctioneer's eyes were wide. "We have $2,000. Mr. Briggs?" Morton Briggs looked like he wanted to commit murder. But after a long moment, he shook his head and stormed out of the hall, shoving people aside as he went. The door slammed behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. $2,000 going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Edwards for $2,000. The auctioneer declared, bringing his gavel down with finality. He looked almost stunned by the turn of events. "Payment is due immediately, sir, as per the terms of the auction." Grace watched in disbelief as Elijah Edwards reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked heavily with coins. He approached the auction table and began counting out gold eagles, stacking them in neat piles while the auctioneer and the bank representative looked on with barely concealed greed. The amount was staggering. Grace had never seen so much money in one place in her entire life. When the count was complete and the payment verified, the auctioneer handed over the deed to the property. Elijah took it, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his shirt. Then, before Grace could fully process what had just happened, he turned and walked directly toward her. The crowd parted again, and Grace found herself trapped between the wall and this mountain of a man who now owned everything she held dear. Up close, he was even more imposing. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and she realized with a start that she could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the foot of space between them. He smelled like pine needles and leather and something else, something wild and masculine that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not entirely understand. You Grace Tanner? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the buzz of conversation that had erupted in the room. She nodded, not trusting her voice. This is yours, he said, pulling the deed from his shirt and holding it out to her. Grace stared at the folded paper as though it were a snake that might bite her. I do not understand, she whispered. Your land, your home. It belongs to you. He pressed the deed into her hands, his fingers rough with calluses, warm and strong as they closed briefly over hers. The bank's been paid. The creditors are satisfied. You do not owe anyone anything. But why would you? Grace's mind was reeling, unable to make sense of what was happening. I cannot accept this. I have no way to repay you. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Elijah's weathered face. I am not asking for repayment. Then what are you asking for? Grace demanded, finding her voice at last. There had to be a catch. Men did not simply hand over $2,000 to strangers out of the goodness of their hearts. What do you want from me? Elijah was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those unsettling gray-green eyes. I heard about your situation in town, he said finally. Heard you were about to lose everything because of debts that were not your fault. Seemed wrong to let that happen if I could prevent it. You do not even know me. No, he agreed. But I knew your father. He helped me once, years ago, when I was new to these parts and did not know the territory. Probably saved my life, showing me where the good water was and warning me about which passes to avoid in winter. I never got the chance to thank him properly. Figure this is close enough. Grace felt tears threatening again, but this time they were not entirely from grief. My father never mentioned you. Would not have expected him to. It was a long time ago, and it was only one day we spent together. But I do not forget a kindness. Elijah glanced around the room, where people were still watching them with unconcealed curiosity. This is not a good place to talk. You got somewhere we can go that is more private? Every instinct Grace had told her she should not go anywhere alone with this stranger, no matter how generous his actions seemed. But she also knew that she needed answers, and she was not going to get them with half the town eavesdropping on their conversation. She nodded toward the door. There is a bench outside, in the shade. They walked out together, and Grace was acutely aware of the whispers that followed them. By tomorrow, everyone in Kelton would be speculating about what was happening between Grace Tanner and the mysterious mountain man who had paid off her debts. The thought should have bothered her more than it did. The bench was behind the meeting hall, beneath a struggling elm tree that provided minimal shade from the blazing sun. Grace sat down carefully, still clutching the deed to her property like a lifeline. Elijah remained standing, his eyes scanning the horizon with the alertness of someone accustomed to watching for danger. Where did you come from? Grace asked. I have never seen you in Kelton before. I live up in the mountains, about 20 miles north of here, Elijah said, nodding toward the rugged peaks visible in the distance. I trap mostly, do some hunting, trade pelts in Corinne and Ogden. I come through Kelton maybe twice a year for supplies I cannot get elsewhere. And you just happened to arrive on the exact day of my auction? I arrived 2 days ago, he corrected. Heard about what was happening and spent some time asking questions, making sure I understood the situation correctly. When I was satisfied that you were being treated unfairly, I decided to intervene. Grace shook her head slowly. I still do not understand why. $2,000 is a fortune. You could have used that money for yourself, for your own land or business or whatever else you might need. I have everything I need, Elijah said simply. and money does not mean much to me beyond what it can buy in terms of supplies and necessities. I have been trapping for 8 years now, living alone in the mountains. You accumulate a fair amount of gold when you have no one to spend it on and nothing you particularly want. 8 years alone? Grace could not imagine such isolation. Even in her grief, she had been sustained by the presence of neighbors and the routines of town life. Do you never get lonely? Something shadowed Elijah's face. Sometimes, he admitted, but lonely is better than some alternatives I have experienced. Grace sensed there was a story there, but she did not press. Instead, she looked down at the deed in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the reality of what it meant. "This is too much," she said quietly. "I cannot simply accept such a gift from a stranger. It would not be right." "What would be right?" Elijah said, his voice hardening slightly. "Would be if the bank had given you a fair chance to settle your father's debts instead of rushing to auction everything off within months of his death. What would be right would be if your neighbors had helped you instead of showing up to buy your possessions for pennies on the dollar. I am just trying to balance the scales a little." He had a point, Grace had to admit. The bank could have extended her more time, could have worked with her to arrange a payment plan. And it stung that so few people had offered genuine help when she needed it most. Still, accepting such generosity from a man she had just met felt wrong on a fundamental level, as though she were taking advantage of his good nature. "Let me work for you," she said suddenly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "Let me earn back at least part of what you have spent. I can cook, clean, sew, tend animals, work a garden. Whatever you need, I will do it until the debt is repaid." Elijah frowned. "That is not necessary." "It is necessary to me," Grace insisted. "Please, I need to do this. I need to know that I have not simply taken advantage of your kindness." He studied her for a long moment, and Grace got the impression he was seeing more than just her surface appearance, as though he were measuring something deeper about her character. Finally, he nodded. "All right. If it matters that much to you, I will accept your help. But understand that I do not expect you to repay the full amount. That would take years." "Then I will work for years," Grace said firmly, relief flooding through her. It was not a perfect solution, but it restored some sense of control and dignity to a situation that had left her feeling powerless. "We will figure out the details later," Elijah said. "For now, you should go home and rest. You look like you're about to fall over." Grace realized he was right. The emotional turmoil of the day had left her exhausted, and the heat was not helping. She stood up carefully, still holding the deed. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "I know I keep saying I do not understand, but truly, thank you. You have saved my life today. Maybe you will have a chance to save mine someday," Elijah said with the faintest hint of a smile. "That would make us even." Grace watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him quickly down the dusty street until he disappeared around a corner. She looked down at the deed again, half expecting it to vanish or turn out to be a forgery. But it was real, solid, legal. Her home was hers again. The land where her parents were buried would not be torn apart by strangers. She could breathe again. The walk back to her property took 20 minutes, and with every step, Grace tried to make sense of what had happened. Elijah Edwards was unlike any man she had ever encountered. The men of Kelton were mostly farmers and shopkeepers, hard-working but conventional in their thinking and behavior. Elijah seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of civilization, a man who had chosen solitude and wilderness over community and comfort. Yet he had also demonstrated a capacity for compassion and generosity that put most supposedly civilized men to shame. Her small cabin came into view, looking shabby and worn in the harsh sunlight. The barn needed repairs, the fence was falling down in places, and the vegetable garden had suffered from her inability to focus on anything but survival these past months. There was so much work to be done, and now she would actually have the chance to do it. The relief was almost overwhelming. Grace went inside and carefully placed the deed in the wooden box where she kept her most important documents. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, put her head in her hands, and finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for her father, for her mother, for the terror and helplessness she had felt watching everything slip away. And she cried in gratitude for the strange mountain man who had appeared like something out of a legend and changed everything. When the tears finally subsided, Grace washed her face in cold water from the pump and set about making herself something to eat. She had been too anxious to eat breakfast, and her stomach was making its displeasure known. As she moved around the familiar kitchen, slicing bread and cheese, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Elijah Edwards. Who was he really? What had driven him to the mountains? And what had he meant when he said lonely was better than some alternatives? She was still pondering these questions when she heard a knock at the door. For a moment, her heart leapt with the irrational hope that it might be Elijah returning. But when she opened the door, she found instead her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tendency toward gossip. "Grace, dear, I had to come see if the rumors were true," Mrs. Patterson said, bustling inside without waiting for an invitation. "They are saying in town that some mountain man bought your land and then gave it back to you. Surely that cannot be right." "It is true," Grace confirmed, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "His name is Elijah Edwards. He said he owed my father a debt, and this was his way of repaying it." Mrs. Patterson's eyes went wide. "A debt of $2,000. What on earth did your father do for this man?" "He helped him when he was new to the territory, gave him advice about water and safe passages through the mountains." "And for that, this Elijah fellow just handed you back your land?" Mrs. Patterson looked skeptical. "Grace, you need to be careful. Men do not part with that kind of money without expecting something in return." "He has not asked for anything," Grace said, though she felt a twinge of unease. Mrs. Patterson was only voicing the same concerns that had already crossed her own mind. "Not yet, perhaps," Mrs. Patterson said darkly. "But mark my words, there will be expectations. A man like that, living alone in the mountains for years, he probably thinks he has bought himself a wife." "I am going to work for him to repay the debt," Grace said, trying to keep her voice level. "That is all. It is a business arrangement." "Work for him doing what?" Mrs. Patterson demanded. "And where? If he is living up in the mountains, does that mean you will be going there alone with him?" "Grace, you cannot do that. It would be scandalous. You would be ruined." Grace felt her temper beginning to fray. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Patterson, but I can make my own decisions. Mr. Edwards saved my home. The least I can do is offer him my labor in return." Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to argue further, but something in Grace's expression must have warned her to back off. "Well," she said, sniffing disapprovingly, "I suppose you know your own mind. But do not say I did not warn you when things go awry." After Mrs. Patterson left, Grace sat back down at the table and forced herself to eat, though her appetite had vanished. The older woman's words had struck a nerve, not because Grace thought they were entirely true, but because they highlighted the impossible position she found herself in. By accepting Elijah's help and agreeing to work for him, she was exposing herself to gossip and judgment. But what choice did she have? To refuse his generosity would have been not only ungrateful, but also foolish. She could not simply ignore the fact that he had saved her from destitution. The next morning, Grace woke early and spent several hours working on the most urgent repairs around her property. She fixed a broken board in the porch, mended a gap in the chicken coop that had been allowing predators to get at her hens, and spent time in the garden pulling weeds and checking on her vegetables. The work felt good, purposeful, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to think about the future with something other than dread. She was hauling water from the creek to her garden when she saw a figure approaching on horseback. Even at a distance, she recognized Elijah's broad-shouldered silhouette. He rode a sturdy bay gelding and had a pack mule trailing behind him. As he drew closer, Grace set down her water buckets and wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. "Morning," Elijah said, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle. "Thought I would come by and discuss the details of our arrangement if you are still interested." "I am," Grace confirmed. "Let me just finish watering these plants and then we can talk." "I can help with that," Elijah said, picking up one of the buckets before she could protest. Together, they made several trips between the creek and the garden, working in companionable silence. Grace found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking. In the clear morning light, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. The weathering on his face came from sun and wind rather than age. When the watering was done, they sat on the porch steps and Elijah explained what he had in mind. "My cabin is about 20 miles north of here, up in the foothills of the Raft River Range," he said. "It is not much, just 2 rooms and a lean-to for storage. But it is solid and weatherproof. I do most of my own cooking and cleaning, but I will admit I am not very good at either. The place could use a woman's touch if you are willing to provide it." "What would my responsibilities be?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice businesslike. "Cooking mostly," Elijah said. "Maybe some mending of clothes and gear, general tidying up. I am not asking you to be there all the time. A few days each week would be sufficient. I can provide you with a horse so you can travel back and forth, and I will make sure you have everything you need to be safe and comfortable." Grace considered this. "How long would you expect me to work before the debt is settled?" Elijah shrugged. "Until you feel it has been settled. I am not keeping track of dollars and hours. When you think you have done enough, we will call it even." It was a remarkably trusting arrangement, and Grace felt her respect for this unusual man growing. "All right," she said. "When would you like me to start?" "Whenever you are ready. There is no rush." "I could come tomorrow," Grace offered. "Would that work?" "That would work fine," Elijah agreed. He stood up and walked to his pack mule, returning with a leather saddlebag that he handed to Grace. "Supplies for you. Some coffee, sugar, flour, and salt. Figured you might be running low after everything that has happened." Grace opened the bag and saw that it was indeed packed with staples she had been rationing carefully for weeks. "You did not need to do this," she said, though she was touched by the gesture. "I know I did not need to," Elijah said, "but I wanted to." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat to her. "I will see you tomorrow then. Come before noon if you can. The ride is easier in the cooler morning hours." Grace watched him ride away, the pack mule plodding contentedly behind. She felt a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness about the arrangement they had just made. part of her wondered if Mrs. Patterson had been right to express concern. But another part of her, the part that had looked into Elijah's steady gray-green eyes and sensed his fundamental decency, believed that she was making the right choice. That evening, Grace prepared for her first day of work. She packed a small bag with a change of clothes and basic toiletries, then spent time going through her father's old maps to familiarize herself with the route north into the mountains. The Raft River Range was rugged territory, home to mountain lions, bears, and worse dangers. But Elijah had said he would provide her with a horse, and she trusted that he would not send her into harm's way, unprepared. She was up before dawn the next morning. Too nervous to sleep, she dressed in her most practical clothing, sturdy boots and a split riding skirt that would allow her to sit a horse comfortably. As the sky began to lighten, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching and opened her door to find Elijah leading a pretty chestnut mare with a gentle eye and a calm demeanor. "This is Sage," Elijah said, patting the mare's neck. "She is even-tempered and sure-footed. She will treat you right." Grace approached slowly, letting the horse sniff her hand before stroking her soft nose. "She is beautiful. She is yours for as long as you need her," Elijah said. "Maybe longer if you develop an attachment." They set out together as the sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and pink. The air was still relatively cool, though Grace knew that would change quickly as the day progressed. Elijah set an easy pace, mindful of Grace's inexperience with long-distance riding. As they traveled, Elijah pointed out landmarks and features of the terrain, teaching her the route so she would be able to navigate it on her own. Grace listened carefully, committing everything to memory. She had always had a good sense of direction, a trait her father had encouraged by taking her along on trips to nearby towns and teaching her to read the land. "You are a good student," Elijah observed, after she correctly identified a distinctive rock formation he had mentioned earlier. "Most people do not pay attention the first time. My father taught me that awareness can mean the difference between life and death out here," Grace said. "He used to say that the desert does not forgive carelessness." "Your father was a wise man," Elijah said quietly. They rode in silence for a while, and Grace found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the journey. The landscape was harsh, but beautiful in its own way. All scrub brush and red rock and endless sky. She had spent most of her life in or near Kelton, rarely venturing far from the settlement. And she was surprised to find that she was enjoying the adventure of exploring new territory. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the terrain began to change. Sage and juniper appeared among the rocks, and Grace could hear the sound of water running in hidden creeks. The air grew cooler and fresher, scented with pine. She understood why Elijah had chosen to make his home here. After the dust and heat of the valley, the mountains felt like a different world entirely. They crested a ridge, and Elijah pointed ahead to a small valley cupped between two rocky slopes. "There," he said. "That is home." Grace looked and saw a sturdy log cabin nestled among the trees, smoke rising from a stone chimney. There was a corral for horses, a shed that probably served as a stable, and what looked like a root cellar dug into the hillside. It was more substantial than she had expected, clearly the work of someone who planned to stay for a long time. They rode down into the valley, and Elijah helped Grace dismount, then led both horses to the corral, where two other horses stood watching their arrival with mild curiosity. "Make yourself comfortable," he said. "I will be in shortly to show you around." Grace approached the cabin cautiously, unsure what she would find. The door was unlocked and opened easily on well-oiled hinges. Inside, she discovered a space that was Spartan, but surprisingly clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy wooden table, shelves lined with supplies, and a rocking chair near the hearth. Through an open doorway, she could see a smaller room that contained a bed and little else. What struck Grace most was the sense of loneliness that permeated the space. There were no personal touches, no decorations or mementos. Nothing that suggested the cabin was anything more than a functional shelter. It was as though Elijah had deliberately stripped away anything that might connect him to memories or emotions. She was examining the kitchen supplies when Elijah came in carrying her bag. "What do you think?" he asked. "It is very organized," Grace said diplomatically. Elijah's mouth quirked. "You mean it is depressing and impersonal?" Grace felt herself flush. "I did not say that." "You did not have to. I can see it on your face." He set her bag down on a bench near the door. "I never saw much point in decorating. It is just me here, and I do not need much to be content." "But do you not sometimes want to come home to something that feels warm and welcoming?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. "Something that feels like more than just a place to sleep and eat?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I suppose I stopped thinking about warmth and welcome a long time ago," he said finally. "After a while, you forget what that feels like." There was such loneliness in his voice that Grace felt her heart constrict. She wanted to ask what had happened to him, what had driven him to exile himself in these mountains. But she sensed it was too soon for such questions. Instead, she said, "Well, perhaps we can work on that while I am here. A home should feel like a home, not just a shelter." Something changed in Elijah's face, a softening around the eyes that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "I would like that," he said quietly. They spent the rest of the morning with Elijah, showing Grace where everything was stored and explaining his routines and preferences. Grace took mental notes, already planning ways to improve the efficiency of the kitchen and make the space more livable. Around midday, she prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, and they ate together at the wooden table. "This is good," Elijah said, sounding surprised. "Better than anything I've made for myself in months." "It is just beans and cornbread," Grace protested. "But you seasoned them properly, and the bread is not burnt or raw in the middle," Elijah pointed out. "That puts it well above my usual efforts." Grace laughed and was rewarded with a genuine smile from Elijah, the first she had seen. It transformed his face, making him look almost boyish, despite his size and the hardness of his features. She felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling she was not quite ready to examine too closely. After lunch, Grace spent time tidying up and organizing supplies, while Elijah went out to check his trap lines. She found herself humming as she worked, surprised by how much she was enjoying the simple domesticity of the tasks. There was something satisfying about bringing order to the space, about taking this cold and lonely cabin and making it more habitable. In the late afternoon, Elijah returned with 3 rabbits and a fox pelt. Grace watched as he skillfully skinned and cleaned the animals, stretching the fox fur on a frame to dry. His movements were practiced and efficient, the result of years of experience. When he was done, he brought the rabbit meat inside, and Grace showed him how to prepare it properly, making a stew that would last them several days. As evening fell, and they sat down to eat the stew with fresh biscuits Grace had made, she found herself studying Elijah across the table. In the warm light of the fire, he looked less intimidating, more human. She could see faint scars on his hands and forearms, evidence of a life lived hard and dangerous. But there was also a gentleness in the way he handled things, a carefulness that suggested someone who had learned to value the small comforts available to him. "You are staring," Elijah observed without looking up from his bowl. Grace felt heat rush to her face. "I apologize. I was just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "About how different you are from what I expected." Now he did look up, his gray-green eyes meeting hers. "Different how?" "I thought you would be rougher, more savage. Like the mountain men I have heard stories about. But you are not like that at all. You are gentle and thoughtful and—" She trailed off, realizing she was saying too much. "And what?" Elijah prompted. "And lonely," Grace finished quietly. "You are very lonely, and I think it has been hurting you for a long time." Elijah set down his spoon and was silent for so long that Grace began to worry she had overstepped. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft rather than angry. "You are perceptive," he said. "Yes, I am lonely. I chose this life because I thought it would be simpler, safer than the alternative. But loneliness is its own kind of pain, and sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." "What were you running from?" Grace asked gently. Elijah looked into the fire, his profile etched in shadow and light. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said. "Cholera. We had only been married for 2 years. She was 23 years old, and she died in my arms. And there was nothing I could do to save her." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "I am so sorry." "We lived in Denver," Elijah continued, as though now that he had started talking, he could not stop. "I was working in a lumber mill, trying to save up enough money to buy us a piece of land where we could start a family. But then the disease came, and within a week, half the town was sick. Sarah was strong, she fought hard, but in the end, it was not enough." He paused, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "After she died, I could not stay there anymore. Everything reminded me of her. So I sold what little we had, bought supplies, and headed into the mountains. I have been there ever since." "You have been alone for 6 years?" Grace could not imagine such isolation, such prolonged grief. "Mostly. I go into towns for supplies, but I never stay long, never let myself get close to anyone. It seemed easier that way." He finally looked at her again. But maybe easier is not the same as better. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort and connection. Elijah stiffened at first, as though unaccustomed to human touch. But then his hand relaxed and turned to clasp hers gently. They sat that way for a long moment, the fire crackling and the darkness gathering outside. Two lonely people finding solace in an unexpected friendship. When Grace finally withdrew her hand, she felt a sense of loss, as though something precious had slipped away. But she also felt a new understanding of the man sitting across from her, and a growing admiration for his strength in surviving such devastating loss. "It is getting late," Elijah said, his voice slightly rough. "You should get some rest. You can take the bedroom. I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Grace protested. "You can and you will," Elijah said firmly. "I have slept on floors more comfortable than some beds I have owned. I will be fine." Grace knew better than to argue further. She gathered her things and went into the small bedroom, closing the door behind her. The bed was narrow, but the mattress was surprisingly good, stuffed with what felt like fresh straw and covered with clean blankets. She changed into her nightgown and crawled under the covers, exhausted from the long day. But despite her tiredness, sleep was slow to come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Elijah moving around in the other room, preparing his makeshift bed. She thought about his story, about the young wife he had lost and the years he had spent in self-imposed exile. She understood that kind of grief, the way it could hollow you out and make you feel like you would never be whole again. But she also knew, from her own experience of losing her parents, that healing was possible if you allowed yourself to connect with others, to let people in despite the risk of future pain. She wondered if Elijah would ever be able to do that. She wondered if she could help him, and whether she should even try. This was supposed to be a simple business arrangement, a way for her to repay a debt. But already it was becoming something more complicated, something that involved emotions and vulnerabilities that she had not anticipated. Grace fell asleep with these thoughts swirling in her mind, and dreamed of mountains and loneliness and a man with sad eyes who had forgotten how to hope. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable pattern. Grace would ride up to Elijah's cabin 3 or 4 times a week, spending the day cooking, cleaning, mending, and gradually transforming the stark space into something more welcoming. She brought wildflowers from the valley and arranged them in jars on the table. She made curtains for the windows from fabric she had at home. She organized the shelves more efficiently and taught Elijah how to prepare meals that required minimal effort, but tasted infinitely better than his previous fare. Elijah, for his part, seemed genuinely grateful for her presence. Grace noticed that he talked more easily now, sharing stories about his life in the mountains, the animals he encountered, the changing seasons and their effects on his trapping. He taught her things too, showing her how to identify edible plants, how to read weather signs, how to track game. Grace absorbed this knowledge eagerly, finding that she loved learning about the wilderness in a way she had never expected. More than the practical skills, though, Grace found herself drawn to Elijah himself. She was beginning to see past his rough exterior to the kind and thoughtful man beneath. He was unfailingly courteous, always concerned for her safety and comfort. He had a dry sense of humor that surprised her into laughter at unexpected moments. And sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. She was falling in love with him. Grace realized one day as she was riding home through the golden afternoon light. The knowledge should have frightened her, but instead it felt right, inevitable, as though she had been moving toward this moment since the day he had walked into that auction and changed her life. But she had no idea if he felt the same way, and she was terrified of risking their friendship by revealing her feelings. One evening in early September, Grace stayed later than usual because she was in the middle of preserving a batch of vegetables from Elijah's small garden. The sun had set by the time she finished, and Elijah insisted that it was too dangerous for her to ride home in the dark. "You can stay the night," he said. "It would not be the first time. I will ride back with you first thing in the morning." Grace agreed, though she felt a flutter of nerves at the prospect of spending another night under the same roof with Elijah. They ate a simple dinner and then sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of a creek. "Grace," Elijah said suddenly, his voice serious, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you doing this? I mean, really doing this? You could have stopped weeks ago and considered the debt paid. But you keep coming back, and I need to know if it is just out of obligation or if there is another reason." Grace's heart was pounding. This was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. She could lie, could give him some comfortable excuse, or she could tell him the truth and risk everything. She chose truth. "I come back because I want to," she said quietly. "Because being here with you makes me happy in a way I have not been happy in a long time. Because I have come to care about you, Elijah, more than I probably should." The silence that followed was excruciating. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the stars, unable to look at him, terrified of what she would see in his face. "Grace, look at me." She turned slowly and found him watching her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I have been trying so hard not to feel this way," Elijah said, his voice rough with emotion. "Trying not to care too much, not to hope for something I thought I did not deserve. But every time you ride up that trail, every time you smile at me or laugh at something I said, every time you make this lonely cabin feel like a home, I fall a little more in love with you." Grace felt tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "You love me?" "I love you," Elijah confirmed, reaching out to cup her face in his large, calloused hand. "I think I started loving you the moment I saw you standing in that auction hall. So fierce and brave, even though your whole world was falling apart. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you have brought light back into my life when I thought I would never see light again." Grace turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss to the rough skin there. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you so much it scares me." Elijah leaned forward and kissed her then, gently at first, tentatively, as though he were afraid she might vanish if he held her too tightly. But when Grace responded, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer, the kiss deepened into something passionate and desperate. 6 years of loneliness and longing pouring out between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for a few weeks. But Grace, I cannot imagine my life without you now. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my days making you happy." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, and this time there was joy in it. The pure happiness of two people who had found each other against all odds. Eventually, they moved inside, both too excited to sleep, and spent half the night talking about their future, making plans, dreaming about the life they would build together. "I want to split our time between your place and mine," Elijah said. "We can spend the summers up here in the mountains where it is cool, and the winters down in the valley where it is easier to get supplies. Would that work for you?" "It sounds perfect," Grace said. "I would hate to give up either place entirely. They are both special in their own ways." "We should get married soon," Elijah said. "I do not want to wait. Is that all right with you?" "More than all right," Grace assured him. "I have already waited too long to be happy. I do not want to waste any more time." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Kelton, with Mrs. Patterson and a few other neighbors as witnesses. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had carefully preserved all these years. And Elijah wore a new suit that he had bought specially for the occasion. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothing, but Grace thought he was the most handsome man she had ever seen. The whole town had turned out for the wedding, curiosity overcoming any lingering disapproval. Grace did not care what anyone thought anymore. She had found love with a good man who treated her like she was precious. And that was all that mattered. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at Grace's cabin, now legally belonging to both of them. There was food and music and dancing, and for the first time in years, Grace felt surrounded by genuine warmth and community. Even Morton Briggs, the man who had tried to buy her land at the auction, made an appearance and offered grudging congratulations. When the last guests had finally left and the sun was setting over the valley, Elijah picked Grace up and carried her over the threshold of their home, both of them laughing. He set her down gently in the bedroom and kissed her, slow and deep, his hands gentle as they began to unlace her dress. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice husky. "We can wait if you're not ready." "I am ready," Grace assured him, reaching up to unbutton his shirt. "I want this. I want you." They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies with tenderness and passion. Elijah was gentle with her, constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, and Grace marveled at the contrast between his physical strength and the delicacy of his touch. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Grace's head resting on Elijah's broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Elijah murmured, his fingers stroking her hair. "I thought that part of my life was over, that I would never love anyone the way I loved Sarah. But what I feel for you is different. Not less, but not the same either. It is its own thing, and it is wonderful." "I am glad you loved her," Grace said, tracing patterns on his chest. "That love made you into the man you are, the man I fell in love with. I would never want you to forget her or stop honoring her memory." "You are generous to say that," Elijah said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Some women would be jealous." "I am not jealous of the dead," Grace said. "I am just grateful that you have learned to love again, and that you chose to love me." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, warm and safe and utterly content. The first year of their marriage was the happiest time Grace had ever known. They split their time between the valley and the mountains as planned, and Grace discovered that she loved the wilderness almost as much as Elijah did. She learned to trap and hunt alongside him, to read the signs of changing weather, to navigate by stars and landmarks. She became stronger and more confident, her body adapting to the physical demands of mountain life. Elijah, in turn, seemed to become more relaxed and open. The shadows that had haunted his eyes when Grace first met him gradually lifted, replaced by warmth and humor. He laughed more, talked more, touched her more, as though he could not quite believe she was real and needed constant physical confirmation of her presence. They worked together to improve both properties, building a larger corral at the mountain cabin and expanding the garden at the valley homestead. Elijah proved to be a skilled carpenter, and Grace marveled at watching him work, his powerful muscles flexing as he lifted heavy logs and shaped them with precision. She never tired of looking at him, of appreciating the sheer strength and capability of his body. In the spring of 1880, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to tell Elijah until she was certain. When she finally shared the news one evening as they sat together watching the sunset from their mountain porch, Elijah was so overcome with emotion that he could not speak for a full minute. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he finally managed, his voice thick. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could already see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Elijah said. "Grace, I thought I would never have children, never have a family again. This is more than I ever dreamed possible." They immediately began preparing for the baby's arrival. Elijah built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single rough edge, and Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They decided that Grace should spend the last months of her pregnancy at the Valley homestead, where it would be easier to get help if anything went wrong. And Elijah agreed to stay with her rather than returning to his trap lines. Grace's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she found the summer heat increasingly difficult to bear. Elijah was constantly attentive, making sure she drank enough water, rested frequently, and did not overexert herself. His protectiveness sometimes bordered on excessive, but Grace found it endearing rather than stifling. She knew it came from a place of love, and likely from fear of losing another person he cared about. In early October, as the leaves were turning gold and the air was finally cooling, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Patterson and another experienced midwife named Mrs. Chen attended her, while Elijah paced anxiously outside the bedroom, clearly fighting the urge to burst in and take over despite having no idea what to do. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. More than once, Grace heard Elijah's voice outside the door, demanding to know if she was all right, if there was anything he could do. Mrs. Patterson eventually snapped at him to go chop wood or something useful and stop making everyone more nervous with his hovering. But when the baby finally arrived in the golden light of late afternoon, all the pain and fear melted away. Grace heard her son's first cry and felt a surge of love so intense it was almost painful. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby and placed him in Grace's arms, and Grace looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature and fell completely in love. "You have a healthy boy," Mrs. Chen said, smiling. "Congratulations, Mrs. Edwards." "Can my husband come in now?" Grace asked, eager to share this moment with Elijah. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, and Elijah practically fell into the room, his face pale and strained. But when he saw Grace holding their son, his entire expression transformed. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "He is perfect," Elijah whispered, reaching out with one large finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately closed around Elijah's finger, gripping with surprising strength. And Grace saw tears slide down her husband's cheeks. "He is absolutely perfect. Do you want to hold him?" Grace asked. Elijah looked terrified. "I might hurt him. I am too big, too clumsy." "You will not hurt him," Grace assured him. "Here, support his head like this." She carefully transferred the baby into Elijah's arms and watched as her enormous mountain man husband cradled their tiny son with a gentleness that brought tears to her own eyes. Elijah looked down at the baby with such wonder and love that Grace felt her heart might burst. "Hello, little one," Elijah murmured. "I am your father, and I promise I am going to take care of you and your mother for as long as I live. You are the most precious thing in the world to me, and I will never let anything hurt you." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. They had discussed names endlessly during the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Grace knew exactly what he should be called. "Edward," she said. "Edward Samuel Edwards. Edward after you, and Samuel after my father." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Edward Samuel Edwards," he repeated. "That is a strong name, a good name." He looked back down at the baby. "Welcome to the world, Edward. We have been waiting for you." The months that followed were challenging in ways Grace had not fully anticipated. Edward was a fussy baby who did not sleep well and seemed to have a pair of lungs designed specifically for maximum volume. Grace was exhausted, often barely able to function from lack of sleep. But Elijah was a revelation as a father. He took over as much as he could, walking with Edward for hours when the baby would not stop crying, changing his diapers without complaint, and somehow managing to soothe him in ways Grace could not. "You have a magic touch," Grace said one night, watching Elijah rock their son to sleep for the third time that evening. "I think he just likes the rumble of my voice," Elijah said. "Or maybe he finds my ugly face fascinating." "You are not ugly," Grace protested. "You are handsome and strong, and you are an amazing father." Elijah smiled at her over Edward's head. I am trying my best. I never had much experience with babies before this one. But I figure if I approach it the same way I approach tracking or trapping, paying attention and learning from my mistakes, I will eventually get the hang of it. As Edward grew, his personality began to emerge. He was a curious, active child who seemed to have inherited his father's love of the outdoors. As soon as he could walk, he was toddling around exploring everything he could reach, putting things in his mouth and getting into trouble with a determination that was both exhausting and adorable. He is definitely your son, Grace said to Elijah one afternoon after rescuing Edward from his attempt to climb into the horse trough. He has your stubbornness, Elijah countered, wrapping the dripping toddler in a towel. They settled into a new rhythm as a family, adapting their life to accommodate Edward's needs. The trips to the mountain cabin became less frequent during his first year. But as Edward got older and more manageable, they resumed their pattern of summer in the mountains and winter in the valley. Edward thrived in both environments, showing an early aptitude for the wilderness skills his father taught him. When Edward was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy felt easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect and was less anxious about every little symptom. Elijah was just as protective as before, but Grace was better at managing his hovering and insisting that she could still do most of her normal activities. Their second child, a daughter they named Evelyn Rose, was born in the spring of 1883. She was a much easier baby than Edward had been, content to sleep for reasonable periods and less prone to inconsolable crying. Elijah doted on her shamelessly, carrying her around in a sling against his chest while he did chores, talking to her constantly, even though she was far too young to understand. I think you are spoiling her, Grace said one day, amused by the sight of her hulking husband cooing at their tiny daughter. She is a baby, Elijah said, as though that explained everything. Babies are supposed to be spoiled. You did not spoil Edward this much. Edward was trying to kill himself every 5 minutes. I was too busy keeping him alive to spoil him properly. Evelyn is giving me a second chance to be a ridiculous father, and I am taking full advantage. Grace laughed and shook her head, but secretly she loved seeing Elijah so happy and relaxed with their children. The haunted, lonely man she had first met seemed like a distant memory. In his place was someone warm and joyful, a man who had learned to embrace life again instead of just enduring it. Life was not without its challenges, of course. There were hard winters when supplies ran low and they had to ration carefully. There were illnesses that terrified them both, though thankfully nothing as serious as the cholera that had taken Elijah's first wife. There were accidents and injuries, the inevitable risks of living in wild country. But through it all, they faced everything together, their love for each other deepening with each shared hardship and triumph. When Edward was 5 and Evelyn was 3, they had another addition to their family, a son they named Emmett John. He was a perfect blend of his siblings, active like Edward but more easygoing like Evelyn. With 3 children, life became even busier, but Grace would not have traded it for anything. Their home was filled with noise and laughter and love, everything she had dreamed of and more. The years passed in a blur of milestones and memories. Edward grew tall and strong like his father, learning to trap and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Evelyn was curious and intelligent, constantly asking questions about plants and animals and the world beyond their valley. Emmett was the peacemaker of the family, always trying to smooth over conflicts between his siblings and keep everyone happy. Grace watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness that they would not be children forever. But she took comfort in knowing that she and Elijah had given them a foundation of love and security, teaching them to be strong and kind and capable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Elijah took Grace up to the mountain cabin without the children, having arranged for Mrs. Patterson to watch them for a few days. It was the first time they had been truly alone together in years, and the silence felt strange at first, almost unsettling. "I cannot remember the last time I could not hear children in the background," Grace said, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, just as they had so many years before. "It is peaceful," Elijah agreed. "I love our children more than life itself. But I will admit, it is nice to have you all to myself for a little while." "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Giving up your solitary life for all the noise and chaos of a family?" Elijah turned to look at her, his gray-green eyes serious. "Not for 1 second," he said firmly. "Grace, you saved my life. Before I met you, I was not really living. I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting for time to pass. You gave me a reason to live again, a reason to hope and dream and plan for the future. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. Even after 10 years of marriage, Elijah could still make her cry with his sincerity and depth of feeling. "You saved me too," she said. "I was drowning when you found me, overwhelmed by grief and fear. You gave me back my home and my hope, and then you gave me so much more. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You made me whole again." Elijah pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Grace melted into the familiar warmth of his embrace. They made love that night under the stars, taking their time, savoring each other in a way they rarely had the opportunity to do with 3 young children in the house. Afterward, wrapped in blankets on the porch, they talked late into the night about everything and nothing, reconnecting in the way that only long-term partners can. "I want to grow old with you," Elijah said, as the night grew cold and they prepared to go inside. "I want to watch our children have children, and I want to be that old couple sitting on the porch together, still holding hands and still in love." "That sounds perfect," Grace said. "That sounds exactly right." And that, in the end, was exactly what happened. Edward grew up and married a girl from Corinne, bringing her back to live near his parents and starting his own family. Evelyn became a teacher, educating children in Kelton and eventually meeting and marrying a young surveyor who shared her love of learning. Emmett followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a trapper and guide, though he made regular trips back to visit his family. Grace and Elijah watched their grandchildren arrive one by one, marveling at the way their family had grown from just the 2 of them to this sprawling network of love and connection. They split their time between the valley and the mountains, as always, though as they aged, the trips became shorter and less frequent. The mountain cabin eventually became a summer retreat for the whole extended family, a place where grandchildren learned the same wilderness skills their fathers and mothers had learned before them. On a cool autumn evening in 1899, 20 years after that fateful auction, Grace and Elijah sat together on the porch of their valley home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were both gray now, their bodies bearing the marks of age and hard work, but their love had only deepened with time. "Do you remember the day we met?" Grace asked, her hand clasped in Elijah's large, calloused one. "Every detail," Elijah said. "You were standing in that auction hall looking so fierce and brave and beautiful, and I knew in that moment that I had to help you. I did not know then that you would end up saving me right back." "We saved each other," Grace said, leaning her head on his shoulder. That is what love does. It saves us from loneliness and despair and makes us better than we could ever be alone. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Edwards," Elijah said, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely mountain man who did not know what he was missing until he found you." "Thank you for walking into that auction and changing my life," Grace replied. "Thank you for paying a debt you did not owe and giving me back my home. Thank you for loving me and building this beautiful life with me." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. Their children were grown and independent now. Their grandchildren were thriving. And they had the satisfaction of knowing that they had created a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. Inside the house, Grace could hear the sounds of Evelyn preparing dinner with two of her own children, a tradition they had started where the family gathered once a week for a meal together. Soon they would be called inside to eat, to share stories and laughter around the table that had witnessed so many important moments in their lives. But for now, Grace was content to sit beside her husband, holding his hand, watching the day fade into night. Their story had begun with an auction, with cash demanded and freely given, with a mountain man who saw someone in need and chose to help without expecting anything in return. It had grown into something neither of them could have predicted, a love story that spanned decades and generations, a testament to the power of compassion and the possibility of second chances. Grace squeezed Elijah's hand and felt him squeeze back. A wordless communication perfected over 20 years of marriage. They had been through so much together, had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had raised children and built a life from nothing but determination and love. And through it all, they had remained partners, best friends, and lovers, two halves of a whole that fit together perfectly. As the last light faded from the sky and Evelyn called them inside for dinner, Grace took one last look at the mountains where she had first fallen in love with Elijah, where they had spent so many summers teaching their children to appreciate the wilderness and all its beauty. Those mountains had been witness to their courtship, had sheltered them in hard times, had become as much a part of their story as anything else. She thought about the young woman she had been, standing in that auction hall watching her world fall apart, and wished she could tell that frightened girl that everything was going to be all right, that a stranger would walk through the door and change everything, that she would find love in the most unexpected place with the most unlikely person, that she would be happy beyond her wildest dreams. But that young woman was gone now, replaced by a grandmother with gray in her hair and grandchildren on her knee, a woman who had lived a full and rich life and had no regrets. Grace had loved and been loved in return. She had raised good children who were raising good children of their own. She had known hardship and triumph, loss and redemption, loneliness and belonging, and through it all, she had walked beside a man who had started as a stranger, become a friend, transformed into a lover, and ended up as her everything. A mountain man with lonely eyes who had learned to smile again. A husband who had protected and cherished her for 2 decades. A father who had given their children the gift of security and unconditional love. A partner who had made every day of their shared life an adventure worth living. As they walked inside together, Elijah's arm around her waist, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had built. It had not always been easy, but it had been real and true and worth every challenge. They had taken the worst moments of their lives, the grief and loss that had nearly destroyed them both, and transformed that pain into something beautiful. The house was warm and bright, filled with the voices of the people they loved most. Their children and grandchildren gathered around the table, talking over each other in their eagerness to share the day's events. Elijah pulled out Grace's chair for her, a gesture of courtesy he had never abandoned even after 20 years. And she sat down with a smile, looking around at the faces that had come from the love she and Elijah had built together. Edward was telling a story about a stubborn horse, gesturing dramatically and making his children laugh. Evelyn was helping her youngest daughter reach the serving dishes, patient and kind, just as Grace had always been. Emmett had brought fresh game from his latest hunting trip and was describing the track he had followed to bring down a large elk, his face animated with the same passion for wilderness that Elijah had passed down to him. And Elijah sat beside Grace, his hand finding hers under the table, giving her that gentle squeeze that said everything words could not express. They had made it. They had survived loss and found each other. They had built a family and a legacy. They had loved well and lived better. As dinner progressed and the evening wore on, Grace found herself simply observing and absorbing, committing every detail to memory. The way Elijah's eyes crinkled when he smiled at something Edward said. The sound of her grandchildren's laughter echoing through the rooms. The feeling of being surrounded by people who existed because she and Elijah had been brave enough to love again after loss. Later, after the family had departed and the house was quiet once more, Grace and Elijah prepared for bed in the comfortable routine of long marriage. They moved around each other easily, anticipating needs and preferences without needing to speak. When they finally settled into bed, Elijah pulled Grace close, her back against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist. "I love you," he murmured into her hair, the same words he had spoken thousands of times over the years, but which never lost their power or meaning. "I love you too," Grace replied, covering his hand with hers. Always and forever. They fell asleep that way, as they had almost every night for 20 years. Two souls intertwined so completely that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pines, the same smells that had greeted them on their wedding night, and would greet them for however many more nights they were blessed to share. Their story, which had begun with an auction and a mountain man's unexpected generosity, had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It had become a testament to the transformative power of love, to the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds, to the beauty of second chances and new beginnings. Grace and Elijah Edwards had found each other when both of them needed saving. And in saving each other, they had created something extraordinary. A love that had weathered time and hardship. A family that would continue their legacy of kindness and strength. A home that would always be a refuge for those they loved. And as they slept peacefully in each other's arms, the mountains stood watch over them as they had for 20 years, silent witnesses to a love story that had transformed two broken people into something whole and beautiful and eternal. The auction had demanded cash Grace did not have, and a mountain man had paid it all without batting an eye. But what they had both gained in return was worth more than all the gold in the territory. They had gained each other, and that made all the difference.